January 11, 1944. High above northern Germany, the winter sky looked almost metallic. At nearly 25,000 feet, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Hartmann adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon through the armored glass of his Messerschmitt Bf-109. Below him, streams of American bombers pushed deeper into the Reich. Hundreds of them. Slow, predictable. The kind of targets German pilots had intercepted for years, but the fighters surrounding them were different now. For a brief moment, the sky fell silent. Then came the sunlight flashing off aluminum wings. American fighters dropped from above at terrifying speed. They did not turn into combat the way British Spitfires often had. They did not circle for position. They struck once with brutal precision, then climbed sharply back into the sun before German pilots could react. Some Luftwaffe veterans later described the attacks as feeling less like a dogfight and more like an ambush. Inside German formations, confusion spread quickly. Pilots attempting to pursue found themselves losing altitude, speed, and control of the engagement within seconds. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer facing the hesitant American Air Force it had once underestimated. And behind this transformation stood a generation of U.S. fighter aces who had begun rewriting the rules of aerial warfare over Europe. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Germany possessed one of the most experienced air forces on Earth. The Luftwaffe had already tested many of its ideas during the Spanish Civil War years earlier. German pilots entered the conflict with modern aircraft, coordinated tactics, and combat experience that few nations could match. During the invasions of Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries, German fighters moved almost uncontested across European skies. Speed, coordination, and aggressive doctrine became the foundation of German air superiority. By the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe turned its attention toward Britain. The Battle of Britain introduced a new kind of air war. Massive formations crossed the English Channel daily. Radar stations tracked incoming raids. Fighter commands scrambled continuously. It was one of the first sustained battles fought almost entirely in the air. German pilots quickly developed respect for British aircraft like the Spitfire and Hurricane. The Royal Air Force fought defensively but effectively, often relying on tight-turning combat and interception tactics close to home territory. Even when Germany failed to destroy Britain's air defenses, Luftwaffe pilots still believed they remained the finest fighter force in Europe. Then America entered the war. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States rapidly expanded its military presence across both the Pacific and Europe. But in the skies over occupied Europe, the Americans initially faced a difficult reality. The U.S. Army Air Forces lacked combat experience on the scale of the Luftwaffe. Many American pilots arriving in England during 1942 were young, hurried through accelerated training programs designed for rapid wartime expansion. They possessed courage and technical skill, but not the battlefield instincts developed by German veterans who had already survived years of combat. At first, American strategy focused heavily on daylight strategic bombing. The doctrine appeared logical on paper. Large formations of heavily armed bombers, especially the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and consolidated B-24 Liberator, would strike German industry directly during daytime hours. American planners believed tight bomber formations and defensive machine guns could protect the aircraft without relying entirely on fighter escorts. Reality proved far harsher. Bomber raids penetrated deeper into occupied Europe and eventually Germany itself. Luftwaffe fighters attacked relentlessly. German aircraft, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190, exploited weaknesses in American formations with deadly efficiency. The Americans suffered catastrophic losses. In August 1943, during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions, hundreds of American bombers crossed into heavily defended German airspace, targeting ball-bearing factories and aircraft production centers. The Luftwaffe responded with coordinated fighter assaults from multiple directions. Bombers burned across the sky. Crews bailed out over enemy territory. Entire formations shattered under concentrated attacks. The raids demonstrated a painful truth. Bomber guns alone could not guarantee survival deep inside Germany. The 8th Air Force urgently needed fighters capable of escorting bombers farther into Europe. Early escort fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt possessed tremendous firepower and diving speed, but range limitations initially prevented them from protecting bombers throughout the entire mission. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning offered longer range, but struggled in some European conditions and remained difficult to maintain in large numbers overseas. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe fighter pilots still held tactical confidence. German doctrine emphasized aggression, flexibility, and individual pilot initiative. Many Luftwaffe veterans considered American pilots rigid and predictable. They believed U.S. fighters relied too heavily on formation discipline instead of instinctive aerial combat. For a time, that judgment appeared accurate. American fighter groups often remained close to bomber formations, prioritizing protection rather than offensive air superiority. German pilots exploited this restraint repeatedly. They attacked quickly, forced escorts into defensive reactions, then withdrew before sustaining major losses. But inside the USAAF, some commanders had already begun questioning these limitations. One of the most influential was Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke. Zemke had carefully studied both German and Soviet air tactics before the war. Unlike many officers who viewed escort duty as passive defense, Zemke believed fighters should dominate the airspace aggressively. He argued that American pilots needed freedom to hunt enemy fighters before they reached the bombers. This idea represented a major shift. Instead of waiting for Luftwaffe attacks, American fighters would begin seeking combat proactively. Altitude, speed, and energy retention would become more important than traditional turning dogfights. Pilots would attack from superior positions, strike violently, then disengage before losing momentum. The concept sounded simple. In practice, it would slowly transform the air war over Europe. And as 1943 came to an end, new aircraft arriving in England would give American pilots the tools needed to fully unleash that doctrine against the Luftwaffe itself. By late 1943, the air war over Europe had entered a new phase. The Allied bombing campaign was growing larger with every month. American factories, untouched by enemy bombing, were producing aircraft at a scale Germany could no longer match. New bomber groups crossed the Atlantic constantly. Airfields throughout eastern England expanded into enormous military complexes, filled with fuel depots, maintenance hangars, ammunition trucks, and endless rows of aircraft waiting for dawn missions. The skies over. Europe were becoming crowded with machines. But numbers alone did not guarantee victory. The Luftwaffe still possessed dangerous advantages. German pilots operated close to home territory. Downed airmen often returned to combat within days. Radar networks warned of incoming raids. Anti-aircraft batteries protected industrial regions with dense defensive fire. And despite increasing fuel shortages, many German fighter leaders remained highly experienced veterans of years of warfare. Some had fought since Poland in 1939. Others survived the Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, or North Africa. Their combat experience far exceeded that of most American pilots arriving in England during 1943. Luftwaffe aces frequently accumulated astonishing victory totals. Men like Erich Hartmann, Adolf Galland, Walter Nowotny, and Günther Rall became symbols of German aerial prestige. Inside German fighter units, confidence still existed. American bombers were dangerous, but predictable. Their formations followed planned routes. Their escorts usually stayed close to them. German commanders believed concentrated attacks could continue inflicting losses severe enough to force the Americans to reconsider daylight bombing altogether. But beneath that confidence, pressure was building. Every raid forced the Luftwaffe to rise again. Every interception consumed fuel Germany increasingly struggled to replace. Experienced pilots were becoming harder to train and impossible to easily replace once lost. Young German recruits entered combat with fewer flight hours than earlier generations. Many arrived at frontline squadrons already exhausted by shortages, constant relocation, and collapsing infrastructure. Meanwhile, the Americans were learning rapidly. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt began demonstrating qualities German pilots initially underestimated. Heavy and massive compared to many European fighters, the aircraft did not excel in tight-turning combat. But at high altitude and in dives, the Thunderbolt became extraordinarily dangerous. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine generated immense power. The aircraft could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter fighters. Equipped with 8 50-caliber machine guns, it delivered devastating fire during high-speed passes. Most importantly, American pilots discovered the Thunderbolt retained energy extremely well during diving attacks. This realization changed tactics completely. Instead of entering prolonged turning engagements against agile, German fighters, experienced USAAF pilots, increasingly used altitude as a weapon. They climbed above incoming enemy formations, built speed through steep dives, attacked in concentrated bursts, then escaped vertically before German aircraft could respond effectively. The tactic relied on discipline rather than instinctive maneuvering. Pilots had to resist the temptation to chase every enemy aircraft into twisting dogfights. Losing speed meant losing survival. American formations trained repeatedly to maintain altitude advantage, mutual support, and controlled aggression. Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group became one of the most famous examples. Flying P-47 Thunderbolts painted with distinctive markings, Zemke's pilots developed a reputation for ruthless efficiency. German pilots began encountering American fighters willing to range far beyond bomber formations in search of combat opportunities. The escorts were no longer passive guardians. They were becoming hunters. Then came the arrival of the P-51 Mustang. Originally designed with British cooperation, the Mustang transformed after receiving the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The aircraft combined speed, long range, high-altitude performance, and maneuverability into one of the most effective fighters of the war. For the first time, American escorts could accompany bombers deep into Germany and remain there. This changed the psychological balance of the air war almost overnight. German pilots, who once waited confidently for bombers to outrun their escorts, now found American fighters still present over targets hundreds of miles inside Reich territory. Luftwaffe formations climbing to intercept bombers increasingly encountered Allied fighters already positioned above them. The hunters were becoming the hunted. American fighter doctrine also evolved operationally under commanders like General Jimmy Doolittle. In early 1944, escort fighters received greater freedom to leave close bomber protection and aggressively attack German aircraft wherever they appeared. The policy unleashed enormous pressure on the Luftwaffe. American fighters strafed airfields, attacked aircraft during takeoff and landing, and disrupted German formations before they could organize effective interceptions. Luftwaffe pilots now faced constant danger even before reaching bomber streams. Combat reports from both sides reflected the shift. German pilots increasingly described American fighters attacking from superior altitude with coordinated speed. Instead of circling into traditional dogfights, the Americans struck suddenly, broke away cleanly, then repositioned for another attack. Attempting to follow them often meant bleeding away precious energy and becoming vulnerable to other Allied fighters nearby. For some Luftwaffe veterans, the change felt deeply unsettling. The air war they once understood was disappearing, and by the beginning of 1944, the skies above Europe were preparing for a brutal contest that would decide not only the survival of Germany's air force, but the future of the war itself. For much of the early war, fighter combat over Europe followed patterns pilots understood instinctively. Aircraft turned tightly for position. Pilots attempted to get behind opponents. Dogfights became swirling circles of speed, instinct, and endurance. Experienced Luftwaffe veterans excelled in this environment. Many German aces had spent years mastering close-range maneuver combat against British, Soviet, and Allied pilots. American pilots entering Europe initially struggled against that experience, but the USAAF possessed an advantage Germany increasingly lacked: the ability to adapt on a massive scale. By 1943, American fighter leaders began rejecting the idea that escorts should remain tied closely to bomber formations at all times. Protecting bombers still mattered, but commanders like Hub Zemke understood something critical about aerial warfare. The pilot who controlled altitude usually controlled the fight. Instead of exhausting themselves in turning battles against agile German fighters, American units increasingly emphasized what pilots called energy fighting. Speed became protection. Altitude became offensive power. The fighter that entered combat faster and higher could dictate when the engagement began and when it ended. The P-47 Thunderbolt became central to this philosophy. Heavy, but enormously powerful, the aircraft thrived in diving attacks. American pilots learned to climb high above approaching German formations, dive through them at extreme speed, fire short concentrated bursts, then use momentum to escape upward before retaliation became possible. To German pilots accustomed to prolonged maneuver combat, these attacks felt unnervingly brief. There was often little warning. A formation would appear from above. Machine gun fire would erupt suddenly across the sky. Then the Americans disappeared, again into cloud or sunlight before defenders could organize pursuit. The tactic demanded patience and discipline. Young American pilots had to resist emotional reactions inside combat. Chasing damaged enemy aircraft too low often led directly into traps. Veteran leaders repeatedly instructed their squadrons to preserve speed, maintain formation awareness, and attack only from favorable positions. This method slowly eroded one of the Luftwaffe's greatest strengths. German veterans still possessed remarkable individual skill, but skill mattered less when the enemy refused to fight on equal terms. By early 1944, many American units were no longer reacting to German attacks. They were engineering the conditions of combat itself, and for Luftwaffe pilots who had spent years believing they controlled Europe's skies, the psychological impact was becoming impossible to ignore. Combat at high altitude often unfolded in seconds. Pilots flying over Europe endured freezing temperatures, limited visibility, oxygen fatigue, and constant tension long before enemy aircraft appeared. Inside Luftwaffe cockpits, survival depended on awareness. Missing a single movement in the sky could become fatal almost instantly. As American tactics evolved, German pilots began facing a new kind of uncertainty. Earlier in the war, enemy fighters generally behaved in recognizable ways. RAF aircraft often defended specific zones. Soviet pilots on the Eastern Front fought differently again. Experienced, German aces developed instincts for anticipating reactions during combat. But American fighter groups during 1944 became increasingly unpredictable. USAAF pilots attacked from higher altitudes. They used the sun aggressively to hide approach angles. Some formations deliberately stayed quiet on radio frequencies to avoid detection. Others positioned themselves miles ahead of bomber streams, waiting for German interceptors to climb directly into ambushes. The result was psychological exhaustion. German pilots climbing toward incoming bombers could no longer assume they understood where the real threat existed. Sometimes, American escorts appeared above them before the bombers themselves became visible. Other times, fighters attacked German formations while they were still assembling after takeoff. Combat reports described growing frustration. Luftwaffe pilots attempting to pursue diving P-47s frequently discovered the Americans had already regained altitude advantage before interception became possible. Chasing them downward often exposed German aircraft to additional Allied fighters waiting nearby. The danger multiplied continuously. By 1944, Germany also faced severe pilot shortages. Many experienced veterans had already been killed or wounded. Younger replacements entered combat with dramatically reduced training hours compared to earlier Luftwaffe generations. Some new pilots received barely enough fuel for operational preparation. Against increasingly coordinated American fighter groups, these inexperienced airmen entered one of the most dangerous airspaces in history. Fear inside German squadrons rarely appeared openly in official propaganda. Publicly, the Luftwaffe still projected confidence and resistance. But private accounts told a harsher story. Pilots spoke about exhaustion, about endless bomber streams, about Allied fighters appearing everywhere at once. Some Luftwaffe veterans later admitted the psychological pressure became as dangerous as combat itself. Each mission carried the growing realization that the Americans were not simply replacing losses faster than Germany could inflict them. They were learning faster too, and high above the Reich, that realization began changing the emotional balance of the war long before Germany officially lost control of its skies. Technology alone does not win wars, but in the skies over Europe, certain aircraft fundamentally changed what pilots believed was possible. For German fighter crews encountering late-war American escorts, two aircraft became especially significant: the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the North American P-51 Mustang. They represented different philosophies of combat. The P-47 Thunderbolt looked enormous compared to many European fighters. Its wide fuselage and massive radial engine gave it a bulky appearance that caused some Luftwaffe pilots to underestimate it initially. German aviators nicknamed it the Jug after its shape, believing it too heavy to compete effectively in maneuver combat. But once battle began, the aircraft revealed terrifying strengths. The Thunderbolt could dive at speeds dangerous even for experienced pilots. Its rugged construction absorbed punishment that destroyed lighter aircraft. Stories circulated through American squadrons of P-47s returning with shattered control surfaces, bullet-ridden wings, and cylinders torn open by cannon fire. Most importantly, it carried extraordinary firepower. 8 50-caliber machine guns could unleash devastating bursts during high-speed attack passes. German fighters caught in these attacks often had only seconds to react before the Thunderbolt climbed away again. Then came the Mustang. The P-51 Mustang solved one of the greatest limitations facing the American bombing campaign: range. Equipped with external fuel tanks and the Merlin engine, the aircraft could escort bombers across enormous distances while still maintaining excellent speed and high-altitude performance. Suddenly, Germany no longer possessed safe skies deep inside its own territory. Mustangs followed bombers almost everywhere. They intercepted German fighters before attacks formed. They roamed aggressively ahead of bomber streams. They struck railways, airfields, and transport convoys during return flights. Luftwaffe pilots who once relied on waiting until escorts turned back toward England discovered American fighters still overhead, far inside the Reich. This technological shift transformed strategy completely. The Luftwaffe had built much of its defensive system around predictable escort limitations. When those limits disappeared, German interception tactics became increasingly fragile. Aircraft already suffering from fuel shortages and maintenance strain now faced constant pressure from long-range Allied escorts. The machines themselves were becoming instruments of attrition. Every American fighter appearing over Germany represented industrial strength Germany could no longer match by 1944. While Allied production expanded relentlessly, German factories struggled under bombing raids, resource shortages, and collapsing transportation systems. In the end, Luftwaffe pilots were not only fighting enemy aircraft, they were fighting an industrial system that was slowly overwhelming the entire structure of German air power. Air combat depended heavily on leadership, not only from generals planning campaigns, but from squadron commanders making split-second decisions in the sky. During the early years of the war, German fighter leadership excelled at this level. Experienced aces trained younger pilots directly in combat conditions. Tactical flexibility remained one of the Luftwaffe's greatest strengths, but prolonged war gradually destroyed that advantage. Germany's experienced leaders became increasingly difficult to replace. Veteran pilots accumulated hundreds of missions with little opportunity for rest. Some remained in frontline combat continuously because no equally skilled replacements existed behind them. The Americans operated differently. USAAF pilots often rotated home after completing operational tours. This system prevented some combat fatigue while also spreading battlefield experience throughout the broader training structure. Lessons learned in Europe rapidly influenced future pilot instruction across the growing American Air Force. Command philosophy also shifted aggressively under leaders like General James Doolittle. Before 1944, escort doctrine often prioritized staying physically close to bomber formations. Doolittle recognized this approach surrendered initiative to the Luftwaffe. German fighters could choose when and where attacks occurred, while escorts reacted defensively. The solution was simple but radical. American fighters would seek out German aircraft proactively. Escort groups gained greater freedom to sweep ahead of bombers, attack enemy airfields, and disrupt formations before interception could even begin. The change forced the Luftwaffe into increasingly reactive operations. German pilots now climbed into combat already under pressure. Some formations encountered Allied fighters almost immediately after takeoff. Others found escort fighters waiting above assembly points before organized interception became possible. The Luftwaffe still fought fiercely, but initiative, the ability to control combat conditions, was slipping away. This shift carried enormous psychological consequences. For years, German fighter doctrine emphasized aggression and confidence, but by 1944, many Luftwaffe units were defending rather than dominating. Pilots increasingly focused on survival rather than tactical freedom. Fuel shortages restricted training. Allied attacks disrupted logistics daily. Radar stations and command networks faced constant bombing. The system itself was beginning to fracture. American leaders recognized this vulnerability clearly. Destroying aircraft mattered, but exhausting pilots and disrupting operational rhythm mattered just as much. Every forced scramble, every interrupted landing, every damaged runway slowly weakened Germany's ability to sustain organized air defense. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe still possessed dangerous aircraft and highly skilled aces, but it no longer possessed strategic control of the skies. And soon, during some of the largest air battles in history, that reality would become impossible to hide. The winter of 1944 brought a level of air warfare Europe had never seen before. Every clear morning over England began the same way. Engines started before sunrise. Ground crews worked beneath floodlights and freezing wind. Bomb carts rolled across hardened runways, while pilots received weather briefings beside maps covered in red route lines stretching deep into Germany. Then the bombers began taking off. Hundreds of aircraft climbed into formation above the English countryside, assembling into vast aerial streams that could stretch for miles. B-17, Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators crossed the channel in carefully. Organized combat boxes, while escort fighters circled above them in layers of protection. But something had changed by early 1944. The escorts no longer behaved like defensive shields. Under General Jimmy Doolittle's revised doctrine, American fighters increasingly pushed far ahead of bomber formations, searching aggressively for Luftwaffe interceptors before they could organize attacks. The skies above Germany became a battlefield of movement and anticipation rather than static interception. One of the most important moments came during what American airmen later called Big Week. Beginning on February 20th, 1944, Allied air forces launched a massive coordinated campaign against German aircraft production facilities. The objective was not simply to bomb factories. It was to force the Luftwaffe into open combat on a scale it could no longer sustain. Wave after wave of bombers crossed into Reich territory. Targets included aircraft assembly plants in Leipzig, Regensburg, Brunswick, Gotha, and Schweinfurt. German radar stations tracked the incoming formations immediately. Across airfields throughout Germany, pilots scrambled toward their aircraft as warning sirens echoed across frozen runways. The Luftwaffe had little choice but to fight. If German fighters failed to intercept, critical aircraft production centers would suffer devastating damage. But rising into the air now meant confronting enormous numbers of American escorts operating with unprecedented aggression. For many German pilots, the shock came before combat even fully developed. American fighters were already waiting. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs positioned themselves above likely interception routes, using altitude and sunlight to conceal approach angles. Luftwaffe formations climbing toward bomber streams suddenly found themselves attacked during ascent, before proper organization could even form. The American tactic relied heavily on energy advantage. U.S. fighters often refused close turning engagements entirely. Instead, they attacked from superior altitude in coordinated diving passes, a burst of machine gun fire, a high-speed crossing attack, then immediate vertical separation before German pilots could react effectively. Inside Luftwaffe cockpits, the effect was disorienting. Veteran German pilots were accustomed to controlling engagement tempo through maneuver and experience, but now many found themselves reacting constantly to attacks appearing from above and behind at extraordinary speed. Some attempted pursuit. That usually worsened the situation. American fighters retained speed through dives exceptionally well. German aircraft chasing them downward often lost altitude discipline and became vulnerable to additional Allied escorts nearby. Many Luftwaffe pilots later described the sensation of never fully regaining tactical balance once combat began. The skies over central Germany turned chaotic. Contrails twisted across high-altitude formations. Burning aircraft fell through cloud layers, trailing black smoke visible from the ground below. Bomber gunners fired continuously at attacking fighters, while escort groups intercepted German formations from multiple directions. During Big Week alone, the Luftwaffe suffered severe losses, but the numbers only told part of the story. More damaging was the gradual destruction of experienced personnel. Veteran German pilots who survived years of warfare were now being killed faster than replacements could be trained. Fuel shortages already limited. Preparation for younger airmen entering combat. And the Americans understood exactly what was happening. The bombing campaign was no longer focused solely on factories or infrastructure. It had become a deliberate campaign against the Luftwaffe itself, against its pilots, leadership, training system, and operational endurance. Then, on some missions, German pilots encountered a tactic that felt especially demoralizing. A transformation built not on a single moment of brilliance, but on years of adaptation, industrial scale, and tactical evolution that reshaped aerial warfare itself. As the war in Europe drew toward its final months, the skies no longer decided who might win the conflict. They simply ensured how quickly the outcome would arrive. The air war over Europe in World War II did not end with a single decisive strike. It ended through accumulation of pressure, of distance, of time. What began as a contest between skilled pilots and advanced aircraft slowly transformed into something larger than individual combat. By the later stages of the war, the skies were no longer shaped only by courage or experience. They were shaped by production capacity, operational endurance, and the ability to adapt faster than the enemy could respond. German fighter pilots entered the war with confidence built on early victories and refined doctrine. For a time, that confidence was justified. The Luftwaffe set the standard for modern aerial warfare in the opening years of the conflict. But warfare does not remain static. Every advantage eventually invites adaptation. The Allied response, particularly the American evolution in long-range escort, tactics, and aggressive fighter doctrine, changed the balance of control over Europe's skies. Aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang were not just machines of combat. They became extensions of a system designed to sustain pressure continuously across vast distances until enemy capacity began to break. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer fighting for dominance. It was fighting for survival under conditions it could no longer fully control. What makes this phase of the war historically significant is not only the scale of destruction, but the shift in what air superiority came to mean. It was no longer about winning individual engagements or producing exceptional pilots alone. It became about sustaining control over time, ensuring the enemy could not recover, reorganize, or safely operate within its own territory. The sky over Europe became a constant presence in the war below it. Factories, railways, and cities were tied directly to aerial outcomes. Ground offensives succeeded or stalled depending on whether the air above them was contested or dominated. In that sense, the pilots on both sides were part of something larger than themselves, a system where every mission contributed to an expanding imbalance. There is also a human dimension that runs through this transformation. For German pilots, the experience increasingly became one of erosion, of familiarity giving way to unpredictability and control giving way to reaction. For American pilots, it became a learning curve compressed by necessity, where survival depended on discipline, coordination, and the ability to exploit altitude and speed with precision. Neither side experienced the war as abstract history. They experienced it moment by moment in cold air at altitude, with engines vibrating, visibility narrowing, and decisions made in seconds that carried irreversible consequences. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, revealed this reality with brutal clarity. For years, German planners understood that any Allied landing in Western Europe would require enormous air support. The Luftwaffe was expected to contest the skies aggressively over the invasion beaches, disrupt naval operations, and attack troop concentrations before the Allies could establish a foothold. But when D-Day arrived, German air presence remained shockingly limited. Thousands of Allied aircraft dominated the skies over northern France. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, transport planes, and naval patrol squadrons operated with overwhelming freedom. German units on the ground often reported seeing almost continuous Allied air activity throughout daylight hours. Many Wehrmacht soldiers later described feeling abandoned from above. The Luftwaffe still fought where possible, but it lacked the operational strength needed to challenge Allied control effectively. Years of attritional losses against American escorts had drained experienced personnel and weakened coordination across the entire system. Fuel shortages now became catastrophic. Synthetic oil plants inside Germany had suffered repeated bombing attacks throughout 1944. Refineries, rail lines, and storage depots were heavily damaged. Luftwaffe pilots frequently received reduced training schedules because fuel simply could not be spared. Some replacement pilots entered combat with dangerously little flight experience. Earlier in the war, German trainees often accumulated hundreds of flying hours before operational deployment. By late 1944, many young pilots reached frontline units with only a fraction of that preparation. They faced experienced Allied escorts in one of the harshest combat environments imaginable. The difference became deadly almost immediately. American fighter groups increasingly encountered Luftwaffe pilots unable to maintain formation, discipline, or tactical coordination under pressure. Veteran German aces still remained dangerous opponents individually, but the broader institutional strength behind them was collapsing. Meanwhile, Allied fighter doctrine continued expanding aggressively. Escort groups no longer focused solely on bomber protection. Sweeping fighter patrols attacked transportation networks, locomotives, fuel convoys, and communication lines across occupied Europe and Germany itself. The battlefield extended far beyond the sky. Entire regions became vulnerable to constant aerial disruption. German aircraft production illustrates the scale of the crisis clearly. Ironically, German factories produced thousands of fighters during 1944, including advanced aircraft like the Focke-Wulf FW-190D and Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter. On paper, these developments suggested technological resilience. In reality, Germany increasingly lacked the operational structure necessary to use them effectively. The Me 262 demonstrated extraordinary speed advantages over Allied piston-engine fighters. Some German leaders hoped the jet could reverse the air war entirely, but fuel shortages, inexperienced pilots, maintenance difficulties, and relentless Allied attacks on airfields prevented the aircraft from changing the strategic situation. Even revolutionary technology could not. Rebuild a collapsing system. American escorts adapted quickly to new threats as well. Allied intelligence tracked German jet bases aggressively. Fighters attacked vulnerable aircraft during takeoff and landing when the Me-262's speed advantage mattered least. The pattern repeated itself constantly throughout late 1944 and early 1945. The Luftwaffe remained capable of isolated tactical successes. But strategic recovery had become impossible. Combat reports from German units increasingly reflected exhaustion rather than confidence. Pilots described overwhelming Allied numbers, constant fuel restrictions, and the inability to replace experienced personnel. Some squadrons relocated repeatedly to avoid bombing raids against their own airfields. The psychological transformation inside Germany's Air Force was now complete. Earlier in the war, Luftwaffe pilots often entered combat believing they held qualitative superiority over their opponents. By late 1944, many simply hoped to survive another mission. And across Europe, Allied ground forces were advancing beneath skies the Luftwaffe could no longer truly control. By late 1944 and into 1945, the air war over Europe had shifted into its final, grinding phase. What remained of the Luftwaffe was still dangerous in isolated encounters, but it no longer functioned as a cohesive force capable of contesting Allied air dominance on a strategic level. Instead, it operated in fragmented pockets, reacting to raids, defending shrinking airfields, and attempting sporadic interceptions that rarely altered. The larger outcome, Allied air supremacy, had become the defining condition of the battlefield. This dominance reshaped the entire European war on the ground. Rail networks inside Germany were repeatedly disrupted by fighter-bomber attacks. Locomotives were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Bridges, fuel depots, and road convoys became constant targets. The movement of German reinforcements slowed dramatically, creating logistical gaps that Allied ground forces exploited during advances across France, Belgium, and later into Germany itself. The sky was no longer a contested space. It had become an Allied operational platform. German civilian areas experienced the consequences as well. Strategic bombing campaigns expanded in intensity, targeting industrial centers, transportation hubs, and urban infrastructure. Cities such as Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, and Berlin suffered devastating raids that reshaped both physical landscapes and civilian morale. Thus, Luftwaffe's inability to consistently intervene in these raids reinforced a growing sense of inevitability inside Germany. Official reports from the period reflect a stark reality. Loss ratios between German fighters and Allied escorts had become unsustainable. Even when individual German pilots achieved success in combat, those victories were overshadowed by continuous attrition in personnel, fuel, and aircraft availability. Training pipelines collapsed under pressure. Flight schools shortened programs drastically due to fuel shortages and time constraints. New pilots were rushed into operational units with minimal experience, often entering combat against Allied veterans who had accumulated hundreds of flight hours in combat conditions. The imbalance was no longer tactical, it was structural. By early 1945, Allied fighter groups were operating deep over Germany with near-total freedom during daylight hours. Luftwaffe resistance still existed, but it could not prevent sustained bombing or protect key infrastructure consistently. Some of the most advanced German aircraft of the war appeared too late to change this trajectory. The Messerschmitt Me-272 jet, the Arado R-234 reconnaissance bomber, and other late-war designs represented significant technological achievements, but their impact was constrained by operational realities: fuel scarcity, Allied airfield attacks, production disruption, and pilot inexperience with jet aircraft behavior. Even when these aircraft entered combat, they faced overwhelming Allied numerical presence and coordinated interception strategies. American and British pilots adapted quickly, focusing on vulnerability windows such as takeoff, landing, and transit to operational altitude. The jet's speed advantage was real, but not enough to overcome systemic collapse. By this stage, Allied leadership no longer viewed the Luftwaffe as a peer competitor. It was treated as a diminishing defensive obstacle. Inside Germany, the psychological state of aircrews reflected this reality. Many pilots flew missions knowing that strategic outcomes were already decided. Some continued fighting out of duty, others out of survival instinct, and many because retreat was no longer possible. Support, Luftwaffe, that had once dominated Europe in the early years of the war, had effectively been reduced to a fragmented defensive force, operating under constant pressure, and above it all, American fighter doctrine, the very system that had evolved through pilots, commanders, and aircraft like the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt had achieved what once seemed unlikely. It secured persistent air superiority deep inside enemy territory. By the end of the war in Europe, the skies were no longer a separate battlefield. They were the condition that made every other battlefield possible. And when control of that space finally stabilized under Allied dominance, the outcome on the ground followed with it. Not immediately, but inevitably. The story of these air battles is ultimately not just about technology or tactics. It is about how systems evolve under pressure until one side can no longer keep pace with change. And in that sense, the freezing moment described by German pilots, the shock of encountering tactics they did not expect, was not a single event in history. It was a recurring signal of a wider shift already underway, a shift that would define the final outcome of the war above Europe.